Hi everyone. As I mentioned in the last video, we're going to be going through all of the steps in the flow of food over the next few videos. So, today we're going to be covering safe purchasing, receiving, and storing of food. So, those three areas are the ones we're going to go over in this video. The first step in the flow of food is purchasing. This is buying the food that you're going to use in your location. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do. You can pretty much only buy from approved reputable suppliers. But we're going to go over a few things in choosing your suppliers and also the guidelines that those suppliers have to follow. The first guideline is that any of your suppliers need to meet local, state, and federal guidelines. This doesn't mean that you can't do things like shopping local. As long as the shops that you're using have the proper facilities and that kind of thing, it's always encouraged to be able to use local suppliers. You can buy produce directly from growers as long as it's not cut. All meat that you get needs to be USDA inspected, so as long as your suppliers meet those guidelines, then you should be good to go. All of your suppliers need to follow good manufacturing practices or good agricultural practices. These are usually described by their acronyms GMP or GAP. These practices ensure that your suppliers are providing food that's both safe and high quality. If they are following GMP and GAP, they'll have this evidence, but they need to have documentation of training their employees in food safety, proper cleaning and sanitizing procedures, a plan to follow if they have any recalls, which we'll go over that in a little more detail later on, and a HACCP, which is Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point plan, or a food safety plan. So as you can tell, there's not a whole lot that you as a food service worker or manager can do in the area of purchasing, but you can seek out documentation and gather information about what your suppliers are doing to keep your customers safe. So the next step in the flow of food is receiving, and this is food coming into your location. This is where your liability begins. So there's a lot of steps that you follow as the food is coming in to the back door. When you're scheduling your deliveries, they need to come in off-peak times. So for example, if you serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you might want to schedule them to come between 10 and 11 or between 2 and 4 so that you won't have as many customers in the building to take care of at that point. The reason that you want to schedule these deliveries at a non-peak time is all of your TCS foods like meat and dairy are going to need their temperatures to be measured. You also want to inspect all your packaging to make sure that it doesn't have any damage, and you also want to be able to store all of your items quickly and properly so that items are not being time temperature abused or they're not in areas where they could be easily contaminated. Any TCS foods or temperature control for safety foods are going to need to be checked as they come in the back door. If you reject these items, then you're not responsible for payment. But if you accept them and then find out there's a problem, then you're going to have to pay for the item and order more to fulfill your order. You're going to check different items in different ways. Any meat, poultry, and fish, you're going to need to use a probe and check the internal temperature of that as it comes in. So you will need to open packaging for that. The exception is if it's frozen. If it's frozen, as long as it's solidly frozen and doesn't show any signs of thawing and refreezing, you don't have to check the temperature of those, but any fresh ones you do. You may also receive items that are in reduced oxygen packaging or vacuum packed. This means that those items are at increased risk of Clostridium botulinum or botulism, so it's very important that these not be time temperature abused. But you don't have to open the packages in order to check the temperature. You're just going to put the probe in between two of the packages and check the temperature that way. Any other TCS foods like milk, yogurt, prepackaged salads like potato salad, all of those, you're going to open them and use a probe to check the temperature of them. Specific temperatures that cold food needs to be received at. Most cold food needs to be received at 41 or below. This includes things like meat, seafood, and poultry, any pre-prepped salads like potato salad or chicken salad, cut produce, yogurts and cheeses, pretty much all of your TCS food. There are, however, some exceptions. The first of which is milk. And milk needs to be at 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and it has to be cooled to 41 or below within 4 hours, but it is allowed to be received at a higher temperature than some of your other cold foods. Eggs can be received at an air temperature of 45. You use an air probe to measure the temperature of the delivery vehicle, and as long as it's 45 or below, then you're good to go. Live shellfish, that means fresh caught, can be received in an air temperature of 45 and an internal temperature of 50 degrees. And this may seem a little strange since shellfish are one of the things that we learned can cause a lot of foodborne illness issues. The reason for this is that when it's fresh caught, the air temperature of 45 is okay because it's been caught pretty recently, and the internal temperature of 50 degrees is because if it was lower than that, then your shellfish would probably not be alive. Once you actually check the internal temperature though, that shellfish is not going to be alive anymore, so that means that it needs to be cooked or served very, very quickly. With shellfish like oysters, clams, and mussels, when they are alive, the way that you know that they're alive is that their shells are tightly closed. So if they are slightly open, poke them, and if they don't spring back closed, that means that they've already died. This means that they could have been time temperature abused, and so it's important to get rid of any that have open shells. Any shellfish, once they're shucked, meaning removed from their shells, or if their shells have been opened, need to be at 45 or lower, and they need to be cooled quickly to 41 or below in 4 hours. Frozen food should be delivered at a temperature that keeps it frozen solid. You should also have no signs of melting and refreezing. This means things like water stains, ice crystals, or if you have things like frozen vegetables, if they're solid and not easily separated, that probably means that they've been thawed and refrozen at some point in time. In addition to all your temperature requirements, you also want to check all of your food items and your single-use items like cups and plates and that kind of thing for any other signs of contamination. The first thing is you want to make sure that there's no signs of pest. That includes you check the packaging to make sure that there's no mouse droppings or anything. Sometimes you'll see evidence that they've almost set up even a little nest in things, or you might have signs of chewing or biting on different boxes. So you don't want any slimy, sticky, or discolored meats. So for example, you want your beef to be red and not brown like this. You want your pork to be pink and not gray. If it's a solid cut, it should spring back when it's touched and not leave an indentation. Any of your meats and produce should also smell fresh and not overbearing, so nothing should smell abnormal. Also, don't accept any dented, bulging, or busted cans. The bulging ones especially can be dangerous because that can show Clostridium botulinum contamination, which is botulism. The dented and rusted ones could potentially have issues later on. If you are receiving any fish or seafood, it's important to be aware of shell stock tags. Shell stock tags are required on any shellfish, farm-raised fish, and any fish that's served raw. You keep them 90 days after the last fish that's used, and this is due to parasite risk because parasites take a while to become obvious to a general consumer, and any farm-raised fish need to be raised according to FDA standards. A shell stock tag is going to include who caught or raised the fish, the date that it was caught or harvested, where it was caught or harvested, and this is important because fish, just like humans, if they are all in the same area, they're more likely to have a certain exposure to bacteria or illness. It's going to include the type of fish and then how much of that fish is in the packaging. All of this information helps you track down foodborne illness risk and any recalls that might happen with those particular fish. When food is received, you want to train specific staff to receive the food and check it properly. They need to look at the delivery truck and check for cleanliness and proper storage temperatures, and for that they need to use an air probe to check the air temperature of the delivery truck used for any TCS food. Accepting the deliveries means accepting the liability for the cost, so inspect carefully because once that is accepted into the building, it means that you have to pay for it, and if you find problems later, that means that you're going to be responsible for that and have to buy new product. Check the temperatures of all of your TCS foods in the ways that we described earlier. Finally, you want to check for any signs of contamination, any signs of pest, any signs of water damage, pretty much anything that looks like it could cause a problem for food safety. It's also important to look at any chemicals that come in and make sure that they haven't contaminated any of the food that you're receiving. Sometimes you'll be informed by your supplier that one of the items that they've shipped you has been recalled. Food can be recalled when there's some sort of foodborne illness risk or if there's an unidentified allergen that's on the label. For example, milk contamination, egg contamination, any one of the big 8 that we talked about earlier. The vendor should notify you if they have any idea that the food that they have is unsafe, but you should still monitor FDA and USDA notices of any of the products that you use regularly. If you receive word that any of your food has been recalled, there's a few steps that you need to follow to make sure that that food doesn't make it to a customer's table. The first thing is identify the product. Look at lot numbers, manufacturer dates. Any of the food items that you receive will have some sort of thing that identifies when it was manufactured or where it was caught, so that you're able to know exactly which product might have a contamination risk. Any recalled food needs to be taken out of use, but keep it in the proper storage location, such as the cooler or freezer, to make sure that it doesn't grow any more bacteria or have further contamination risk. Label it well, mark it do not use and do not discard. Sometimes the manufacturer will need the product back in order to test it. You also want to make sure you inform your staff verbally and even show them where it is. You want to make sure that no mistakes are made in using this product after it's been recalled, because if you're aware of the recall, you become responsible for anyone who gets sick after that. Communicate with your vendor or supplier on instructions about what to do with the item. Some of them will say to discard it, and if you discard it, you want to make sure that it's very obvious there's something wrong with the food, because sometimes people do go dumpster diving. Sometimes they want you to return it for testing, which means that they'll be testing it for whatever foodborne illness is present or allergen. But you're not liable for payment for these items, so make sure to communicate with the supplier about how they'll either credit your account or give you new product to replace that's been recalled. So the last thing that you need to know about when it comes to receiving is that there's something called key drop deliveries. And this is where your suppliers or deliverers are going to let themselves into your building and drop your food off in off hours. This is done with places that might be closed for dinner or only open for breakfast. But there are some guidelines for this. The first thing is you need to inspect it as soon as you come into the building the next day or later on. It needs to be from a pre-reputable supplier, but we know this already. It has to be stored at the correct temperatures. So dry storage items need to be between 50 and 70, cold storage needs to be below 41, and then anything that's frozen needs to be put into the freezer. So everything needs to be put into its proper area. Anything that's for dry storage can be just left inside the door, but it also has to be honestly presented, which means that you know that this item is new and that you need to look at it. You don't want them putting items away or putting things into their places where they're normally stored, because you need to be able to look at everything that's new and know that those items are correct. All these items also need to be stored in a way that prevents cross-contamination or chemical contamination. So if you're getting cleaners in and things, they need to be stored or dropped off in an area slightly different than the food items. This category we're going to talk about in the flow of food in this video is storage, and this is where and how your food is going to be stored. Regardless of where your food is stored, all of it should be labeled if it's not in the original packaging, and the original packaging will include a label. Your labeling needs to include the common name of the food and then a date. This date could be either the date it's prepared or the date to discard, but this needs to be standardized for your particular location so that everybody knows what that date means. Ready-to-eat food can be stored for 7 days, and this is food that's been prepared on site. It includes leftovers that are going to be reheated just before they are given to a customer as well. And your date that you're going to discard that goes with the earliest food prepared, because sometimes you utilize leftovers to make other foods. So for example, if you make rotisserie chickens on April 1st and you're going to make chicken salad with those rotisserie chickens on April 2nd, you're going to go with the date you would discard the chicken of April 7th rather than the date you would discard the chicken salad of April 8th. Whatever ingredients you have in there, you go with the earliest ingredients discard date. This also goes for things like use by dates for any of the products that you're getting in. Storing temperatures for foods are extremely important. This is what keeps bacterial growth at bay and keeps products from becoming contaminated. Cold foods need to be at 41 or below. Typically, this means your cooler temperatures need to be at least 39 or below in case you put things into the cooler that are higher than that temperature. Dry storage needs to be between 50 and 70 degrees. This is difficult in a food service kitchen because a lot of times those kitchens get very, very warm. Hot foods need to be at 135 or above, but you can't hold hot foods indefinitely. Frozen foods need to be at a temperature that keeps it frozen. When it comes to cold storage, there's a few guidelines that will help you stay in compliance with food safety guidelines, but also make sure that your food is as safe as possible. The first is to check the temperatures of the food in cold storage regularly. Frozen food, you just have to pretty much check that it's frozen solid, but you need to make sure that all the food that's in your coolers is at 41 or below. You also need to have a temperature gauge at the warmest part of the fridge. This is generally going to be towards the door because that's the area that's exposed to open air the most. And finally, you want to make sure that you don't pack your fridge and coolers completely. Air can't circulate when it's packed up really tightly. This means your system is working a lot harder, you're more susceptible to breakdowns, and things don't cool down or stay cold as much as they need to. You should also use open instead of solid shelving to allow for air circulation as well. Another important concept when it comes to putting your items away is FIFO, or first in, first out. This means that items with later use-by dates should be put behind items with earlier use-by dates. You want to check your dates in receiving and place accordingly when putting them away. Don't use food items past the recommended use-by date. This helps with a few different things. It means your freshest product is going out to your customers, which helps with food quality. It also means that you're going to have less opportunity for bacteria and things like that to grow. Preventing cross-contamination in storage is extremely important, and there's a lot of different ways that we do that. The first of which is to store any chemicals separately from food and single-use items. This makes sure that you don't have any chemicals dripping on any of your food items or things like paper plates, paper cups, napkins. The next thing is that all of your shelving needs to be 6 inches away, off the ground and away from the wall. This prevents little things like mice and roaches and any sort of bugs from coming into contact with your food. It just eliminates a source of access for them. Any storage containers you use or shelving you use needs to be NSF approved. This means it's going to be used to lots and lots of use, and it also means that it's going to be properly stored so you don't have leaks and things like that. Any food containers need to be used for food and chemical containers for chemicals, and they should not be mixed up. All of your surfaces, including storage locations, floors, walls, including the walls of your coolers and fridge, and things like your dry storage areas need to be cleaned regularly, and any food contact surfaces need to be cleaned and sanitized. Any dirty linens need to be kept away from food as well, because this means that you don't have bacteria growing in areas that are going to come into contact with food. Cold storage needs to be either wrapped or covered so that things don't drip into it. You also want to make sure that you're not storing things like raw meat above cooked food or ready-to-eat food like lettuce. That way, when things are heated up or when they're not cooked, you're not going to have raw juices on things that are not going to be heated to a temperature high enough to destroy bacteria. To prevent cross-contamination in refrigerated storage, we store things from top to bottom, from least hazardous to most hazardous, and this is based on the temperatures that you're going to be cooking things to. Because if something drips onto a lower shelf, the things on that lower shelf are going to be cooked to a higher temperature than those on the shelf above. So we're going to review what goes on each shelf and what temperatures the things on that shelf are cooked to. On the top shelf are ready-to-eat foods and things like leftovers. Leftovers don't have to be reheated to any particular temperature, so they stay on the top shelf so that things don't have to be heated beyond a certain point. Your next shelf is going to be fish and shellfish. These are cooked to 145 degrees, and there's also other foods that are cooked to 145, but fish you want to make sure that you don't overcook, so this goes on the next shelf directly underneath ready-to-eat food. The third shelf is going to be whole cuts of beef and pork, steak, chops, and roast. These are cooked to 145 as well, but they're not as susceptible to overcooking as fish is. The fourth shelf is going to be any ground meats, including sausage, and ground fish like salmon burgers, but it doesn't include ground turkey and ground chicken. Everything on this shelf gets cooked to 155. The reason for this is that 155 is the temperature that kills E. coli. Another consideration with ground meat is that when you're cooking things like steaks and chops, if you sear the outside, you have a minimal risk of foodborne illness. But with ground meat, because everything's ground up and mixed together, the risk of foodborne illness goes up dramatically. The bottom shelf is going to be any poultry, so chicken, turkey, and duck. This also includes ground poultry like ground turkey and ground chicken. The reason for this temperature is that by cooking things to 165 for 15 seconds, you're going to kill any salmonella that is present. By following this plan when storing your food, you're going to ensure that anything that drips from higher shelves onto lower shelves is going to be cooked to a high enough temperature to kill any bacteria that would have been present in the higher shelves. The final thing to review is the places not to store food. So locker rooms and bathrooms so that they don't come into contact with fecal matter, mechanical rooms due to things that could leak, near any garbage, under sewer lines or any leaks that you have, or under stairs because of things that can be dropped down as people are coming downstairs. Thank you for joining us in this review of the flow of food, purchasing, receiving, and storage.